Just moments before she was set to participate in a breast cancer charity walk, a Tennessee med student is shot dead, allegedly by her ex-boyfriend. The horrific incident unfolded on October 19th when deputies responded to a report of a fatal shooting in the parking lot of the Shelby Farms Visitor Center in Memphis, Tennessee. When authorities arrived, they made a horrific discovery. 22-year-old Ellie Claire Young lying dead on the ground near her Jeep Wrangler with several gunshot wounds. When police spoke with witnesses, they said they saw Ellie sitting in her Jeep in a parking space when a white Honda SRV with a temp tag from Kentucky pulled up behind her. According to the police affidavit, license plate reader cameras showed Ellie's Jeep entering the park at 12:11 p.m., with the Honda following just a few seconds behind her. And the driver was allegedly someone who used to be close to the med student, as police identified the driver as 26-year-old Jackson Hopper. When Hopper pulled up to Ellie's car, he allegedly fired off 2 shots into the back of her car. According to the affidavit, Ellie got out of her Jeep, and that's when Hopper fired at least 1 more shot into her as she was lying on the ground. After the brazen shooting, Hopper then allegedly re-entered the Honda and left the scene, all while the cancer walk was still going on. After the shooting, police put a be on the lookout or BOLO alert for the Honda SRV. When police located the vehicle, Hopper allegedly took them on a high-speed chase with speeds up to 80 miles per hour. According to the Tipton County Sheriff, at one point, Hopper even tried to run over a constable while the constable was deploying stop sticks. And Hopper allegedly tried to run over another deputy before he crashed the car. Police claim Hopper tried to fight with officers when he was caught. But according to local station WREG, video showed police allegedly punching Hopper when he came out of the vehicle. Hopper was even spotted with a black eye and noticeable scratches in his mugshot. Following the incident, Lauderdale County Sheriff Brian Kelly said his office is conducting an internal investigation regarding potential officer misconduct. In a statement, the sheriff said, quote, "The Lauderdale County Sheriff's Office never condones personal misconduct, but understands that all sources of information must be evaluated before conclusions can be drawn," end quote. When police processed the crime scene, investigators recovered 5 9mm shell casings and 3 live 9mm rounds at the scene, and a 9mm handgun was recovered at the scene of the Honda crash. Jackson Hopper was arrested for the shocking murder and faces several charges, including first-degree murder, possession of a firearm during commission of a dangerous felony, felony evading, aggravated assault without injury, and reckless driving. And Hopper's high-speed chase tacked on several more charges for him in a separate county, including attempted first-degree murder of an officer, felony evading arrest in a vehicle, reckless driving, and resisting arrest. But for the loved ones of Ellie Young, their lives are forever changed by his horrific alleged actions. Here's what else we know about Ellie. She was studying to become a doctor at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. According to a GoFundMe page, Ellie was a beautiful soul inside and out and dedicated her life towards serving others. According to reports, Ellie and Hopper previously dated for 3 years. They had even made plans to move in together and get married, but according to Ellie's family, they had a recent breakup. Now, as Ellie's family fights for justice, Jackson Hopper will remain behind bars. Let's bring on now criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Jack Rice to break down this case today. Now, Jack, thank you so much for being here today. This case is pretty shocking. An ex-boyfriend allegedly drives up to his ex-girlfriend's car, opens fire in the middle of the day during a charity walk, then flees the scene, later leading police on a high-speed chase. What's been your reaction to this story?
I want to be shocked. I really do. And it is shocking. But you know what's even more shocking about this, and most people really miss this, is when you start talking about domestic assault, and I can say this as a former prosecutor, as a defense attorney, I'm talking about decades of doing this, is that the most dangerous time for somebody to leave a domestic relationship is usually right afterward. Now, check out this statistic. 77% of the time, in especially fatalities, homicides, the likelihood of a homicide happening during a domestic relationship is afterward by 77%. That's according to the NIH, National Institute of Health. That's according to Department of Justice. It just highlights how dangerous these relationships and breakups can be.
And what does it say to you also that it was done in just the middle of the day, just so brazenly, while, you know, the sky is probably still blue, just walking up, or I guess driving up to his ex-girlfriend's car and just opening fire like that, where there are witnesses, there are other people around, there's surveillance video around. What does that speak to you about just the level of, again, brazenness that Jackson Hopper allegedly did this.
When we think about domestic assaults, when we think about violence, when it comes to these are the most emotionally charged cases there are. And in fact, when we think about homicides in general, frequently there is that emotional basis. There is that drive where these things happen, and it isn't frequently thought out. Yes, is it thought out in the sense of a legal sense? Yes, it can be. But what I mean by thought out is that this is not logical. Frequently, what we have here is somebody who has gone so far, dare I say it, around the bend, that the logic is something that is only in their head, something that you would do so brazen, as that's the word you used, of walking into a park. This was a cancer fundraiser in the middle of the day, and then using a weapon to kill the person that you apparently claimed that you once loved. Now, how do you reconcile that? How do you take that experience, those emotions, and twist them, warp them into something like this? It is truly and utterly horrifying. I can't imagine what it must be like for her family, for her friends, for her loved ones to understand, to try to understand this.
And it doesn't appear that this case is a whodunit type of case. So does Jackson Hopper, the defendant, does he have any defenses working for him in this?
Well, it depends on how the prosecution tries to go. I know he's been charged with first-degree murder, but the problem with that sometimes is, yes, I understand the concept. And again, I sort of put on my criminal defense hat, if you will. When you think about the logic of why somebody does something like this, I mean, can you use mental illness? Potentially, there is a way to look at that issue. Is there somebody who is just broken at a certain point? You may plan this, but you may not really understand what it is that you're doing or how you're doing it. Sometimes there's a lower level, a second or a third degree murder charge, where in fact, this is sort of in the heat of passion. Think about this, and this isn't correct, but this is how sometimes this was charged, is you'd have that situation where a man would walk into a room and his wife would be with somebody else. They would charge those differently. Should they? I would argue, as a defense attorney, of course, but as a former prosecutor and somebody who's been doing this for so long, I would say not. There isn't that distinction. But in the law, sometimes you will find it, because remember, as the prosecution, you may be able to prove that this person pulled the trigger, but you also have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt what was going on when they did it. And if you're going to find a way to resolve a case, sometimes there are more logical ways to do it. So a first-degree charge isn't always the simplest, easiest, best way to resolve a case like this.
And kind of going to the prosecutorial side, what are your thoughts about just the level of planning that was kind of done in this case, as opposed to it appearing as this run-of-the-mill, this person may have just snapped in this instance, like you had just mentioned with that example. But what are your thoughts on just that level of planning? Do you think that also helped attribute to prosecutors charging him with first-degree murder?
Without question. And sometimes people imagine that the level of planning that's required is this long, slow, drawn out approach on how you would do this. People will watch movies from World War II and the idea of how I plan to escape from Stalag 13, right? And I'm going to dig through this tunnel, I'm going to go do this, I'm going to do this thing. Well, that would be a level of planning too. But guess what? Simply driving to this event with a gun, that's planning. Simply knowing where she is and going towards her, that's planning. It doesn't take that much. It's the planning stage of, I have a gun in the car and I see her, I pick up the gun, I walk toward her with the gun. Potentially, that in itself is enough. So when you talk about a large, long line of planning that you can establish, it really highlights how the prosecutor can use that to show this was premeditated. His intention when he got in the car was to take that loaded firearm and to kill her with it. And you want to put that in front of a jury because, well, that's what you do. This is the job that prosecutors have. That's why they chose to do it.
And there's also been a lot of controversy surrounding Hopper's arrest, as police are being accused of punching him after the crash when he was arrested, and he was even sporting a black eye in his mugshot. While the sheriff's office says they are investigating the incident, Do you see any problems coming up with the way Hopper was arrested?
Well, potentially. I mean, but you got to remember part of what this is always about for the police is that they have a balancing test, and they're always trying to balance the threat versus the level of force that they have to use. And there was a time, and let's remove the circumstances of this charge from the case itself, and imagine these officers arriving to any scene and approaching somebody. See, because you can't get lost in sort of the facts surrounding it. You also have to look at the decisions being made by these officers themselves. What is the threat level? So you can't dismiss the fact that this is somebody who used a weapon, the fact that this person allegedly murdered somebody. You have to be able to use that, but you also have to balance that with what kind of force is necessary. You have the ability to increase that force level. At the same time, if you're not careful, you can lose the opportunity as a prosecutor. And I can say this as a former federal agent, you lose the opportunity to acquire evidence sometimes if you overstep. Sometimes the statements being made by somebody, sometimes the opportunity to talk to them and say, you're not under arrest yet, knowing full well that they're going to be, because you don't necessarily have to Mirandize. There are protections that come in that place because you're basically trying to get them to, dare I say this, prosecute themselves. And that's really one of the lost opportunities potentially. Now, you also have to look at whether or not they have overstepped, because these are also circumstances where police officers have been known to do this a lot. And all of a sudden, we have seen that they are doing things and deciding to take justice into their own hands. They can't do that. And we have seen prosecutions of officers. I'm coming to you from Minneapolis, St. Paul. I was 8 blocks from where George Floyd was murdered. And we have that situation. I'm not comparing the two, but I'm only using it in the sense of force in terms of an arrest. And when we think about that, it is always something to contemplate when you're dealing with an arrest and violence being used by officers as a part of that arrest.
Yeah, and because of that high speed chase, now Hopper faces several charges across several different counties. Talk to me a little bit about how all these different cases could be prosecuted.
Well, I think they all sort of work together. And I think about this in the context of many cases that I've had. And realistically, we know what the case is. There are lots of peripheral cases that are out there. But dare I say that they're irrelevant? Pretty irrelevant, although they do potentially go to culpability. They can be used in this case in the event that this case goes to trial. So that is important from a prosecutorial standpoint. And so they will use them for that reason. And yet, in the event that we have a resolution of some kind on this murder charge, then what you're going to find is there will end up being what we call a global resolution, where you're basically taking all of those charges and you're putting them together. Even though they're separate counties, even though they're separate jurisdictions, you basically find ways to say, these ones are less important, these ones are less consequential in the bigger sense, because if the big one puts somebody behind bars forever, or in some circumstances, if somebody's facing a capital crime, those lesser charges are less consequential.
Yeah, and let's talk a little about the victim in this case, Ellie. She was on her way to becoming a physician. She was doing this charity walk. And as her family says, she was a beautiful soul inside and out. And I know we talked about this a little earlier in the interview, but does this case give you any indication there was previous domestic violence within her relationship with Jackson Hopper?
Yeah, it sure does. I mean, this really does highlight that. When we think about violence and we think about domestic violence in particular, we see that this frequently has a pattern, and that this is something that isn't a one-off. And in fact, what we have finally seen over the last 15 or 20 years, when I first started practicing many years ago, and as a prosecutor, we didn't chase this in the way that we chase this now, or I don't address this like I do now as a defense attorney, where one of the things you'll regularly see is you'll see officers at domestic calls where they're going to start talking about history. And they'll talk about how many times has this happened before. We'll talk about what kind of threats are we talking about. We're talking about, do they have weapons in the house? Why? Because it goes back to other threats and previous threats and the potential for future threats. And so what you're starting to see is a much broader view of domestic violence when you look at these kinds of cases. Hence, we've even seen changes in how we deal with evidence, how we allow evidence in prior bad acts or specifically in my jurisdiction, a different kind of evidence can be allowed in domestic kinds of cases that you might not be able to get in any other kind of a case because of all of the work that's been done to establish that these are different in some ways than other kinds of cases. If it were just two people who ran into each other and got into a disagreement in a bar, it's not the same.
And I just, I always, when we cover these types of cases, my heart and my head always just goes to the families of the victims and what they're feeling. What's it like speaking to families during this difficult time, especially as the case works its way through the court system? As a former prosecutor, what is it like kind of speaking to the families as they're kind of navigating their own tragedy, but also having to be strong to go through the court process next?
There are really two things when I think, and it's a great question, by the way. It's great in the sense of when I think about the conversations that I had with victims, but I also think about the conversations that they themselves get to have with the court system itself. And maybe if you don't mind, I'd even focus more on that, because when we think about the criminal justice system, prosecutors don't represent these families. Prosecutors represent the people. Prosecutors represent their jurisdiction, and they don't represent the families. And so what you will find is that it's become sort of the prosecutor on the one side and the defense on the other side. And you notice that the families aren't even here. They're not even in this space. And that what we have seen, and this has been something that I think is critically important, is that the ability for victims to speak, certainly to testify when it comes to trials, but in sentencings in particular. And trust me, I've dealt with this at the murder level and at the rape level and in some of the most brutal and heinous crimes you could ever imagine, where you will see somebody stand up and say, "You don't understand the theft that has been taken here. You don't understand what this has done, not just to this young woman, but what has been done to her parents, or her siblings, or the rest of her blood family, or the rest of her family, or the rest of her community." It's the taking of a pebble and dropping it into a pond and watch that just roll out. And that voice, those voices are the ones that have to be, in some ways, I think the most important. They have to be heard, because I can tell you this, as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney, I got a pile this high of cases. I have another pile this high of cases over here. The judges, same. They have probably more. And the thing is that we're all going to move on to the next case. In fact, when we're sitting at sentencing, and dare I say this, we're thinking about what's coming tomorrow or that afternoon. And these families, they're going to hold on to this singular moment for the rest of their lives. And for them to be able to say what this means is maybe the most important little nugget that comes out of all of this. It's not about whether the defendant hears it, or frankly, whether the judge hears it sometimes. It's about them being able to say it. And that's what really counts.
All right, Jack Rice, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Always.
Jackson Hopper has pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder as well as other charges. He's currently being held in the Shelby County Jail in Tennessee with no bond. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.